Hi everyone, my name is Dominika Stala and I am a game designer at Bloober Team company, and I want to talk to you today about death in games. So, every one of us knows this feeling, then I died again. But what does this sentence really mean to us? To answer this question, I should set the definition of it firstly. And I will use the definition set by Randy Smith. He is a designer of TIFF series. So, in a movie or book, even one about violent events, death typically carries significant narrative gravity, something to contemplate and reflect upon. Mortality, tragic loss, the finite versus the infinite, all that jazz. In a video game, by contrast, death is often just a temporary nuisance, a failed jump or missed bullet, a lightweight frustration. The video game version of death emerges from a collection of assumptions about what games are supposed to be. Games are supposed to be about goals. The goals are supposed to be judged and scored. Consistent inability in achieve positive goals should lead to failure. Games are supposed to be about dangerous and violent topics. Altogether, they mean that in a game, you should sometimes fail, and the failure should be death. So, basically, as we can see, in a video games, we used to identify death with failure, payment for our mistakes. Death itself lost its basic meaning. Death is something to contemplate and reflect upon, something serious, something irreversible, something we should contemplate in our minds alone. The real death, or even the books or films' death, can make us sad, angry, and confused, especially when someone we like the main character, dies during the film or book. In the games, however, the death is reduced to a simple form of a punishment. We are not up to challenge. We are not up to the challenge provided by the game, so we must die, and end of story. But, hey, we can always load the game, or be resurrected, or maybe we have 2 other lives, so it's not really a big deal, or is it? Gamers have been dying in games since the beginning of this medium because it was probably the easiest way to communicate to them that they have actually done something wrong, and they must repeat it if they want to beat the game eventually. And Karen Schreier and David Gibson, in their book, Ethics and Game Design, summed it up quite good. We can dismiss a function of death in video games as it clearly served mechanical purpose, lacking philosophical consideration. It exists as a difficulty modifier, a kind of frustration balancing mechanic that provides symbolic and functional penalty. Meaning of death in most video games is failure. And before I will start to talk about actual meaning of death, or maybe precisely the lack of it in the video games, I want to present to you 4 commonly seen types of death. First type is death not possible. The gaming character is not placed in a life-threatening situation or is rescued in the last moment by a godly power coincidence. As you can see, it's the most popular in adventure games and similar ones. Next one is the eternal circuit. If the character dies in one of these games, she is revived at the respawn point. Normally, death has no big consequences. And this type of death is the most popular in online games like MMORPGs, online shooters, and so on, so on. The third one is loading required. In most games, the death of a character is equal to the end of the game. However, the player has the chance to manually save or load the game at any given time, especially in computer games, or at special checkpoints, especially in console games. And this type is probably the most popular type in most of video games, of course single-player games. And the last one is the only chance. Few games treat death as definite end of the gaming character. Revival or saving is not possible. When a gaming character dies, all backups of the save file are automatically deleted. It's also known as permadeath. So, as you can see, the death in games, in comparison to other mediums, is usually taken very lightly. It's pretty clear that maybe aside from the permadeath, death in games has no real consequences at all. Moreover, many narrative-based games have this problem that when our main hero struggles with the hard-to-kill monsters and he's failing over and over again, the challenge quickly changes into a frustration, and eventually it breaks the immersion. Because the player stops focusing on the story, fiction, and stops looking at the game from the avatar side. Instead, he starts to focus on the game's rules and mechanics. And there are, of course, people who enjoy this kind of game. For example, hardcore players who prefers rule over fiction, good gameplay over a good story. Maybe not all of them, but probably the most of them. They want to have a challenge and create strategies and look at the game from the player's perspective. And probably that's okay, because everyone of us is different, and we have different games for casual players as well as for hardcore players. But I believe that nowadays, the number of people who prefer to focus on the narrative part is constantly growing. The people who want to hear an engaging story, who want to immerse in a game's world, who want to be in an avatar's head, thinking about what she or he might say or do. And those who want their inactions have meaning, with death included. And that's also okay, because if you look around, visit the game stores, either digital or virtual ones, you can probably notice that there's certain genres of games, like, for example, adventure games, point and clicks, as well as episodic games, have its own renaissance right now. And recently, I read an article on the internet, and it was a story about a GTA 5 player who decided to die instead of going to hospital because death was more preferable outcome. And I want to show you a fragment of it. It's here. And as we can read, at a 1-star wanted level, if you get arrested, the penalty is that you lose your weapons. At the 2-star level or above, however, the cops try to kill you and send you to hospital. You are charged a hefty bill, but you are also allowed to keep all of your weapons. And since money is so plentiful throughout the game, a twist truth emerges. It's always better to die than get arrested. So, our player made a conclusion. It really took me out of the game world when I realized this, because I began doing things that made sense for me as a player, but made zero sense for me as a character. And this is really important sentence here, because I want to add one important thing, that it's actually good that player can be sent to the hospital or any place like this, because it makes game more immersive. Because, it's natural way of things. You get shot, you're wounded, so you end up there. But the bad thing here is that the death in comparison to this hospital have no real consequences. So he chose death because dying was just the easier way to solve this problem, but in the same time, it kills its immersion. And here we have also an important question, that why we are so eager to choose this type of death, even if we know that it's not really a punishment for a player. But let's get to the next point. Of course, this die and retry approach, where the player is constantly forced to die and repeat certain levels without any alternation, breaks the narrative progression and gives bad emotional engagement to the story. Sure, good fight should cost something, but the death is not a good solution if we can just save and load the game at any given time. But, ludology studies teaches us that, as you can see, focus of the game studies should be on the rules of the game, not on the representational elements, which are only incidental, which means that games are not a good medium to tell stories because they are only about goals and challenges and rules. And, but recent approach toward games, I believe that it has changed, and the developers want to tell engaging stories and want to be narrative and creative about it. But thankfully, from the narratology point of view, games should be understood as a novel forms of narrative and can thus be studied using theories of the narrative, which means, of course, basically that games care about fiction as well. So I believe that this attitude towards failure and death will also change in time, just like games change in time. So, okay. We talked about different approaches towards death, and now I want to talk to you for a minute about genres, because the question is we can talk about the genre when death is an important but overlooked aspect? And I believe the answer is yes, and it's horror. Horror is a much more complex and specific genre, mostly because it's scariness. Horror must be scary. We all know that. Horror must have this dark, tense atmosphere that makes player to be afraid of everything around him. It's quite hard to obtain this level of immersion. But what the death has to do with all of this? First of all, the frustration. Let's imagine a situation that you are the main character of the horror game, and you only thing you can do is run and hide, and of course you don't have any weapons to defend. And that's the moment when the monster appears. And he catches you, and of course you die. And you die 1 time, 2 times, 3 times, 10 times. And probably for the first 2 or 3 times you were terrified of him. But what about the next 8 times? It remains a routine, because you are not scared anymore, and you don't care about the atmosphere because you are focused on the rules, because you know that the monster is there and you are here and you must, go somewhere to avoid him. And because you are not scared anymore, that is the moment when the horror actually fades away. And many horror games have had this problem because they want to scare the player, but they also want to provide a challenge for him. And that's the moment when the monster appears, because it's a visible apparition of something that the player should be afraid of. But sometimes it goes south, as in an example I described earlier. And when we finally became familiar with this monster, when he is constantly killing us, and when we discover who he really is, it makes him less scary. So we lose this tension, and we are not, of course, afraid anymore of him. And it's more about the balance and not breaking the flow of the game caused by unnecessary deaths. Because, as you all know, probably, when you are watching the horror movie, you can be sure that in a 99.9%, the main hero of this movie will not die until the end of it. But you can still be afraid of what you are seeing on the screen, or maybe, most importantly, not seeing, because we are the most afraid of the unknown, of this enigma and mystery atmosphere. And probably, of course, there is group of horrors which are based on the challenge, rules, and goals, but that's a different kind of experience, and it's games like slashers, for example. Let's go to the next point. Okay, I presented you earlier different types of death, as well as we talked in a minute about genre, and I want to go back to these types of death, because some of them, as you can see, try to ease players' frustration caused by death, like, for example, giving them 3 lives, picking up where they left, marking checkpoints, or allowing the player to save the game whenever they wish. But now I want to show you how other developers try to solve this problem in a little more creative ways. And first we have Mass Effect Trilogy and its Mass Effect 3. And this solution is the most popular in shooters and similar genres. Of course, there are exceptions because it's an action RPG, but you probably know this from this type of games. And here, the protagonist can regenerate health after escaping the source of the damage, and the player knows exactly when he must avoid the fire and go to someplace safe. And because when our hero gets shot, the player can hear his heartbeat, and the colors on the screen start to fade and turn red. So the next example, we have Prey, and in this game is really interesting and innovative alternative to clothing, because in this game, after you die, you are transported to a kind of a spirit world where you must kill the demons in order to go back to the real world. And sorry. And here, each successful shot in this demon gives you more health or spirit energy, and after you gather enough resources, you can go back to the real world. And it's an interesting example because here the player must earn your way through this world in order to go back to where they left. And the next example is BioShock. And here, of course, when our protagonist dies, he immediately awakens in Vita Chamber. It's a place you can see here on the screen. And it was built to bring people back to life, and it becomes a major plot later in the story. The next example. Here we have Rogue Legacy. And death in a Rogue Legacy does not quite represent a death finality, because it literally allows the player to develop its own narrative legacy, because here, when you are play as a main character and you die, you can start the game as your child. And with each birth and each death, the heritage of your family becomes more unique, and traits of your grandparent or the great-grandparent are still visible in your rock here. So it's a really nice example. And the next we have EVE Online, and I choose this because it's interesting when you see the other online games and you compare it to the other online games. Because here, during the game, you can make clones of yourself, and with all the experience and the traits you have acquired during the game. And I like to compare it with save points in single-player games, or checkpoints maybe. But the tricky part is that making the clone is not a cheap thing, because these clones have his own brain capacity, and the more costly the clone, the more storage room you have for your own experience. So this means that the more you play in this game, the more you need to invest in your clones. Otherwise, when you die, you will be respawned in a clone who has much less experience capacity than you have in the moment of the death. Okay, the next example. We have Prince of Persia, Sons of Time. It's probably a game everyone knows because it's a popular series. And here, our main hero, can turn back time for a few seconds and save yourself and save himself. But what's interesting here is that in this example that even if he eventually runs away with his daggers of time bending powers and he won't be able to reverse his action, resulting in his death, instead of a standard screen, we can hear a narrator who's speaking, no, 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 that's not what happened. And that kind of mechanic makes this game more immersive. It's a really smart feature because it's just one sentence, but it's also a proof that you don't need much to make the death more narrative, because you can treat it as a whole, as a story, yeah? And the last example is Prince of Persia from 2008. I believe I can say it's kind of a spin-off the games. And here, the main hero, every time he's about to die, the Alika, his magic companion, can rescue him and take him to a safe spot. But the downfall is that, according to opinion of some players, that it could make a game too easy. Okay, so we talked a little bit about other developers' solutions, and now I want to tell you a few words about our game, Layers of Fear. I think that you don't see much here. I'm sorry. But in a Layers of Fear is a psychological and psychedelic horror game where you enter the twisted mind of a mad painter, and your goal is to create your magnum opus, the ultimate painting. And so, why do we choose to make death more narrative instead of standard one? First of all, when you are playing Layers of Fear, you don't need to have particular skills to play it, because it's kind of a more, I think I can say, casual type of gameplay, because it's similar to adventure games, where you're exploring the mysterious residence in order to find certain objects, solving puzzles, and experience terrifying events you can see in this house. But there is also a mysterious and scary apparition which wanders around the house, and meeting with her can actually end badly for you, but not exactly in the way you think about it. And because of that, we decided that standard punishment would not cut it, because forcing the player to repeat the whole level would only frustrate him, and our type of game is not, the type of for hardcore players. Our main goal as a designers was to give the player engaging and immersive narration, and we knew we wouldn't achieve it if the player would be constantly forced to load the game. And when we understood this, our next step was to make the game more narrative, and that was the moment when the respawn room appeared. Because when the player died, he was teleported to our respawn room, and without this black screens and game over. And moreover, it's a finite number of deaths a player can experience, as well as finite number of respawn rooms, so that it makes each death unique, if I can say that. And moreover, the death in our game also can be avoided. So it's also up to the player that he died or not. And finally, we also decided that we will tie death with a main game, with a main plot of the game, and because it's now our narrative feature, and it has a big influence on the game's endings. And I don't want to spoil too much in case of Some of you haven't played it yet, but in the layers of fear, death also has a symbolic meaning. Think about the question, is it real? Why he's so obsessed? Why he's constantly failing? Or does he fail? Etc. Three distinct endings, from which two are what we are called definite, will give each player unique experience. And some people, after we released the game, said that it does not hold any real challenge because, after all, you don't have to actually run away from the monster. But our game is not quite about the challenge. It's about, as I said, experiencing a dark and tense atmosphere and feeling this hero madness and tragedy. So, to sum up, while the gaming worlds become more complex and more detailed, the existing death concept did not change. And I assume that in a genres focused on action, this simplicity might be actually used for keeping a fast pace of the gameplay. But this diversification is actually healthy for the industry because that mechanics focused strictly on the gameplay as well as those enriched by the narrative. We need both of them, and I believe my point is we need more diversity. And that's why I want to encourage all of the designers and developers to be more open to experiment with different approaches towards death, and maybe to make it more creative and meaningful. And if your game explores any kind of meaningful narrative, I think it would be great to make also death a part of it. So, thank you for the attention. Are there any questions? Okay, thank you.